Taoiseach, today marks the one-month anniversary of the brutal Hamas attack on Israel, in which 1,400 people were killed, 1,000 were injured, and at least 243 people were kidnapped. We now know an Irish-Israeli girl, 8-year-old Emily Hand, is among those who were kidnapped. I know everyone in this House is hoping for Emily's safe return, and indeed for the safe and swift return of all hostages. Taoiseach, Israel has a right to defend itself from attack, but what's happening in Gaza is not a defence, it's an annihilation. The entire strip is being reduced to death and dust. The scale of the devastation is unprecedented. Nowhere is safe. UN schools, hospitals, media centres, bakeries and residential buildings have all been deliberately targeted by Israeli missiles. More than 10,000 people have been killed in just a month, including more than 4,000 children, 89 UN workers and 39 journalists. 1.5 million people have been displaced. More than 2 million people are being denied the essentials to sustain life: food, water and fuel. The ambivalent response of the international community to this litany of war crimes is shameful. The UN Security Council is toothless, the UN General Assembly is powerless, and the EU is rudderless. Ireland is one of only a small number of countries in the West which has even condemned Israel's multiple breaches of international law. Taoiseach, words of condemnation are important, but they're not enough. Words must be followed by action. In this country, enacting the illegal Israeli settlement divestment bill is now a matter of urgency. The EU must also act. The EU is Israel's largest trading partner, with trade between the two amounting to more than 46 billion. Trade is governed by the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which has an essential elements human rights clause in it. This means that either side can unilaterally suspend the agreement in response to serious breaches of human rights. Taoiseach, if Israel's destruction in Gaza isn't sufficient to trigger that clause now, then nothing ever will. Israel is also a participant in Horizon Europe, where Israeli institutions can apply for funding under this 95 billion research and innovation scheme. Access to that lucrative programme should also be immediately suspended. Taoiseach, you've publicly stated Israel is breaching international law. This is not just a violation of its human rights obligations, it is a clear contravention of its trade deal with the EU. There must be consequences for that. So, Taoiseach, I have 3 questions. Do you agree that the EU's trade deal with Israel should be suspended until Israel complies with international law? Do you agree Israel's participation in Horizon Europe should also be suspended on similar terms? And will you enact the illegal Israeli settlements divestment bill as a matter of urgency?
Taoiseach, please.
Thanks very much, Deputy. Ireland condemns the attack by Hamas and other militant groups on Israel and the devastating loss of life that is caused. Attacks on civilians and the taking of hostages is always wrong. Israel's right to defend itself, indeed its obligation to defend itself, must be exercised within the parameters of international humanitarian law. And all parties in all conflicts must abide by international humanitarian law. Its aim is to protect civilians everywhere. It applies in all conflicts, in all circumstances, to state and to non-state actors alike. The situation in Gaza is now critical. It is a deepening humanitarian crisis, and the high number of civilian casualties, particularly children, is deeply shocking. The protection of civilians and de-escalation must be the priority, which is why Ireland has called for a humanitarian ceasefire to allow hostages to be released, to allow foreign passport holders to leave, and to allow humanitarian aid to enter the Gaza Strip. And we're engaging with the European Union, the United Nations, and our regional partners to try to achieve this, and in all cases we're calling for de-escalation. In relation to trade deals such as the EU trade agreement with Israel and also Horizon, these are matters that are European competences on which Ireland can't and should not act alone. These are issues that we have to discuss at European level and can only possibly be agreed at European level. And the truth is there is a very significant divergence of opinion within the European Union. While we were able to agree a common statement in Brussels last week, and we all stand by that, the truth is there are very different views, and very different member states come from very different perspectives on this, and that needs to be understood. Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, coming from a particular perspective, other countries that have experienced serious terrorist attacks at the hands of other Islamic resistance movements, also have a particular perspective on it, and we have a particular perspective on it. It is a good thing that we're a member of the European Union for so many different reasons, because we have a seat at the table, and we do have a say when decisions are being made. But the position that we're at European level now is nowhere near taking actions of that nature against Israel. What we're trying to do is use our seat at the EU table to recentre and rebalance the EU position, to particularly bring the EU to a position where we're calling for a humanitarian ceasefire so that the hostages can be released, so that foreign passport holders can get out, so that the killing stops, and so the humanitarian aid can get in.
Cairns.
Taoiseach, Israel is committing blatant abuses of international law every single second in Gaza. Palestinian civilians are trapped in the world's largest open-air prison, a prison that their jailer is indiscriminately dropping bombs on. More than 25,000 tonnes of explosives have been dropped in Gaza in the past month. And when a missile strikes and buildings collapse, there's no fuel or machinery or anything to dig out the men, women and children who are buried under the rubble. The people who survived the initial strikes are slowly dying under mountains of rubble. The stench of death is everywhere in Gaza, and still the bombs rain down. And I think we all know that Netanyahu's far-right government has no intention of stopping this. So, Taoiseach, we must do whatever we can to stop this massacre. That means using every means at our disposal to exert whatever influence we can. And I know that around the Israel-EU trade agreement that would happen at an EU level, but that's why I'm raising it with you, to see if you'd raise it at the next European Council meeting to request suspension of Israel's trade deal with the EU on the basis of their breach of the clear and unambiguous human rights clause in that agreement. And then that's at an EU level. At a national level, we could introduce the illegal divestment bill, the illegal Israeli divestment bill. So there are several things you could do.
Thank you.
Given what's going on, would you please address those two particular issues in your reply?
Thanks, Deputy. We will do all that we can as a country to try to bring an end to this conflict and to try to ensure that there is peace with justice, so that both Israelis and Palestinians can live in secure and viable states. But we are so far away from that at the moment, and the priority now has to be a humanitarian ceasefire so that hostages can be released, so that foreign citizens can leave, so that we can get humanitarian aid in, and most of all so that the killing can stop. We're using our influence at EU level and UN level to do the best we can to secure that. We've also significantly increased our contribution in terms of humanitarian aid to Palestine. And as I say, when it comes to any kind of trade issues, they're European competence, not something that we can act on, nor should we act on alone. And the EU position has evolved in the past couple of weeks, and I hope it will evolve again. But the main thing we need to get the EU behind, and is not yet behind, is the call for a humanitarian ceasefire, and that'll be what we'll be pushing at the next meeting of the European Council.
Taoiseach, I want to praise you for leadership in calling out what's happening in relation to Israel. It was a little belated, but it has happened, and you have done that, and you've shown leadership in a time where it's needed, but we need to do a lot more. I'm standing here today, a month after the slaughter of 1,400 Palestinians, which I'm on record for condemning. I'm equally on record for condemning what Israel has done, totally against international law, disproportionate, and just not acceptable on any level. Every 10 minutes, a child dies. In a month, we have lost 4,237 children, one child every 10 minutes. That's not self-defence. That's not a defence army. That's a warmongering army. We have lost 10,328 Palestinians in total, 37 journalists, 89 employees with UNRWA, and approximately 25,408 people injured, not to mention 1.5 million displaced and so on. Indiscriminate bombing of civilians, homes, hospitals, refugee camps, schools, entirely against international humanitarian law. Secretary General of the United States has said that Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children. He said the nightmare for Gaza is more than a humanitarian crisis. It is a crisis of humanity. I am asking today that we use our voice. We cannot wait for Europe to mature. We cannot wait for them to get their act together. We need to use our voices to call for an immediate ceasefire, to stop the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, hospital, houses. In destroying Hamas, they're destroying Gaza and the Palestinian people. On what level is that acceptable, Taoiseach? I am asking you, for all of us here, to stand together and make it clear to Israel that we are not behind this. We will not support them. There are many things that can be done. Deputy Cairns has already outlined in relation to the association, the trade association. That's something you can immediately look at. There's also a resolution under the UN that you can look at.
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
Just want to thank Deputy Connolly for raising this issue again and to recognise her long-standing interest in the political situation in the Middle East. And I think all of us watching what we see on our TV news or on social media every day just can't be struck by the number of children who are being killed, often pretty thin, malnourished children for other reasons, the number of journalists who have been killed, and also the number of UN aid workers who have been killed. And these are real heroes, aid workers who've stayed behind in Gaza and not just risked their lives but lost their lives too. And they're real heroes in my view. And I have enormous fears. How long is this going to go on? How is this going to end? Will there be an escalation involving perhaps Hezbollah, Lebanon, other countries, other groups around the world? I have great fears of that. And also, when the war in Gaza is over, who's going to run Gaza and who's going to rebuild it? And I'm not sure anyone has answers to these questions. And that really makes me very concerned about the road the world is currently on. And I know Prime Minister Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, promised mighty vengeance. His words, not mine, mighty vengeance. But that should perhaps be, is valid, I think, when it comes to Hamas, the terrorists who killed those 1,400 people in Israel. It's not when it comes to Palestinian civilians, and far too many have been killed already in this conflict, in my view. And certainly Ireland is using our voice. I'm working hard on this to launch this to the whole government, at EU level, at UN level. We've increased our aid budget for Palestine, for Gaza, money given to the UN, and also using our voice at the UN and at EU level and in bilateral engagements to press for what is now needed urgently, which is a humanitarian ceasefire, so that we can get aid in, so that hostages can be released, and Hamas should release the hostages without any equivocation, and so that EU and other citizens are allowed to leave.
Deputy Connolly.
While I praise you for your initiative and your leadership, we stood idly by for a long time in relation to Israel. And we are complicit in that. When Amnesty released the report in February 22, no response from the government in relation to Israel operating an apartheid regime. There are many, many examples when the 6 human rights organisations were designated as terrorist organisations. Other than a condemnation and concerns, we did nothing. When the refugee camp in Jenin was attacked, we did nothing other than concerns and condemnation. There are things we can do. When the illegal, the investments bill was brought before us, you went for a pregnancy 9-month adjournment rather than actually grasping with it and dealing with it and doing something practical. The same thing with the illegal occupation bill, that the title just escapes me. And let me read from Amnesty, just to finish on Amnesty, if the Comhairle allows me. when the Amnesty report came out nearly 2 years ago. The scale and seriousness of the violations documented in our report make it clear that the international community must drastically change its report. Through its failure to take any meaningful action to hold Israel to account for its systematic and widespread violations and crimes under international law against the Palestinian population, the international community, including Ireland, has contributed to undermining the international legal order and has emboldened Israel to continue perpetrating these crimes with impunity. Apartheid is a crime against humanity, and the international community has an obligation to hold the perpetrators to account.
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
Thanks, Deputy. I hear what you're saying, but I don't think that is a fair assessment of Ireland's position down the years. And I know in the engagement that I've had with the Palestinian Authority, and President Abbas, for example, who I met some years ago, there was a very strong acknowledgement from the Palestinian Authority and Palestinians in general that Irish governments consistently for decades now have been supportive of their cause and their desire to have a state of their own within secure and viable borders. And I think that is recognised. And I know when we were campaigning for our seat on the UN Security Council, the one that we won, there was a very strong sense from Arab countries that Ireland was one of those countries in the European Union, in the West, that listened to their concerns and took a balanced position on these matters. And I know Minister Bryan, for example, has met with some of the groups that you've mentioned and has engaged with them. And I think we've even provided funding for some of those bodies that have been delisted. When it comes to trade, trade is an EU competence, and we can only act on a multilateral level when it comes to something that is very clearly an EU issue. On the divestment bill, there's a timed amendment there. We need to give it consideration. We have to bear in mind the consequences of singling out one country out of 200. Other countries have questions to answer as well, and we'd have to give that careful consideration too.